Here again, and hello to the media, everybody joining us. The last time I was here, the U.S. had just announced a 90-day pause on the so-called reciprocal tariffs on imports from dozens of countries, bringing down rates to a baseline of 10% from a range that was between 11 and 50%. Of course, a lot has changed since then, including last night while I was up reading, which we'll get to a bit later. While the pause did offer some relief compared to the reciprocal tariffs, the 10% levy was added to existing duties, meaning countries, mostly developing countries, faced higher costs to export goods like apparel and agricultural products to the U.S. And while the reciprocal tariffs will no longer go into effect tomorrow, as originally announced, but be extended for another few weeks until 1st of August, this move actually extends the period of uncertainty, undermining long-term investment and business contracts and creating further uncertainty and instability. Economic uncertainty has real-world consequences, as we all know, on countries and on sectors. One telling example of the current uncertainty in global trade is the fluctuation in gold and precious metal flows. In anticipation of higher tariffs, we saw a significant outflow from Switzerland to the U.S. since December. But that trend has reversed after it was announced that gold and other precious metals were exempt from the reciprocal tariffs announced in April. According to U.S. import data released last Friday, trade flows have now rebounded, with imports into Switzerland up by 800% year-on-year in May, which also gives its own message. 800% is a lot. These changes in the trade landscape are part of a bigger trend. Since the beginning of the year, we've tracked more than 150 restrictive trade measures that have been introduced globally. These measures layered on top of a general decline in world trade since the onset of the war in the Ukraine, with its related supply chain disruptions, insecurity, and rising commodity prices have put strains on all economies. But not all countries, of course, feel the impact in equal measure. All these factors hit those with the most to lose the hardest. The countries facing the highest reciprocal tariffs are also the least developed, with Lesotho, Laos, Madagascar, and Myanmar facing rates between 40 and 50%. Laos PDR and Myanmar now both face a 40% rate, as announced yesterday, which is lower than the initial 48% and 44% respectively, but still among the highest announced thus far. Lesotho, which sends close to 60% of its apparel exports to the U.S., is set to face a 50% tariff, overriding the duty-free access provided by the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA, which may in any case expire in September. The future of the country's top industries in question, and tens of thousands of jobs are at risk. Vietnam, on the other hand, one of 3 countries that has negotiated a new rate with the U.S. This developing country, which according to our data sends more than a quarter of all exports to the U.S., now faces a 20% tariff. While it is lower than the 46% reciprocal tariff that it was originally facing, the rate is still double the current 10%. And our data is showing that Vietnam's auto and auto-related exports to the U.S. totaling around $937 million last year, the newly agreed upon tariff could reshape trade between the two countries with implications for other countries in the region. It was also announced over the weekend that countries aligning with certain policies of BRICS countries would face an extra 10% tariff. Note that BRICS is a group of countries from the global south. Now, to widen the discussion a bit, adding to the uncertainty created by the tariffs and related trade measures, we're simultaneously seeing deep cuts in development aid, creating a dual shock for developing countries in the world of trade and aid. G7 countries, which together account for around 3/4 of all official development assistance, are set to slash their aid spending by 28% next year, compared to 2024 levels. This would be the biggest cut in aid since the G7 was established 50 years ago. And this is from Oxfam. In short, in today's context, a perfect storm is brewing. Just as trade becomes more unpredictable, external support through aid is also shrinking. So the question is, what can developing countries do? There are 3 3 actions that we suggest that countries can take to restore a sense of stability and predictability and even find new opportunities to grow. The first is to strengthen regional integration, in other words, your relationships with your neighbors. Countries can invest in building up and strengthening regional value chains in key sectors from critical raw materials and electric vehicles to pharmaceuticals. On this, I want to highlight what I think is one of the most consequential decisions made by heads of government in our generation, the African Continental Free Trade Area. The AFCFTA is not just a regional instrument, it's the redefinition of Africa's place and relationship in the world, with the potential to change the terms of trade. Intra-African trade is now between 14 to 16%. The consequences of rising to 40 to 50% would be transformational in the extreme. We've seen the power of intra-regional trade in accelerating and revolutionizing economic growth in Europe and Asia, where intra-regional trade makes up to 75% for Europe and 60% for Asia of total trade, respectively. Secondly, we need to double down on value addition. Countries need to commit to processing goods in-country before export to retain more value at a time when external factors put pressure on export revenues. Our data show that commodities make up 59% of exports of least developed countries. This share is around twice as high as the share of commodities in exports of other developing and developed countries. There's a direct correlation between the commodity-dependent developing countries and the least developed countries. There are opportunities for growth by pivoting from commodity dependence to value addition. Least developed countries have strong export potential in manufacturing. Our estimates show that 43%, amounting to $109 billion, of the export potential of least developed countries in manufacturing is currently untapped. Opportunities for their export growth in manufacturing can be found in well-known sectors such as textiles and apparel and in metal or mineral products, but also in less traditional sectors such as machinery and electronic equipment and chemicals. Countries can use our export potential map, relaunched last week with new data, design, and functionalities to find new markets for priority sectors. Thirdly, make the small business agenda truly global. The U.S. tariffs are influencing the trade landscape from the top down, but stability can come from the ground up. When small businesses of developing countries are able to continue and even scale their operations, they help bring about stability as they make up 90% of all companies and 2/3 of jobs worldwide. For small businesses to participate more meaningfully in global markets, it's not enough to just equip them with relevant information, skills, and resources. Their insights, innovations, and challenges need to be reflected in policies. And that's why we're partnering with the government of South Africa to convene more than 50 ministers to raise the political importance of the small business agenda at the global level through the first ever global SME ministerial meeting in Johannesburg on the 22nd to 24th of July. There isn't a better time to host this ministerial, as South Africa also holds the G20 presidency this year, prioritizing themes like inclusive economic growth, financial stability, and climate change. So let me just conclude by saying that although uncertainties lie ahead in both the trade and aid landscapes, developing countries can still find ways not only to navigate those challenges, but to take on an active role in bringing about greater stability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very